And good evening to those of you here with us in the room this evening. There are many of you, and thank you for coming. Good evening as well to those of you listening in from home, from their offices, online, in both France and beyond. I know that you are following these conferences closely, and we really are delighted to be organising them alongside ICOM France. And I would like to give a special welcome to Émilie, Girard, the president, and a big thank you to all of the teams involved in the organisation of this conference. These are incredibly important moments where we question and engage in dialogue on a number of different topics. We're calling these ethics issues, but ethics in the broadest possible meaning of the term, any questions that we are facing today. So the question today is very important. Can we exhibit everything? Museums at the heart of contemporary debate. You saw the arguments in the invitations distributed. This is a topic that we're interested in at the INP, and soon we will have study days on the exhibition of sensitive objects with the drawing press office. So we are differentiating between these two events, the one tonight and then a later one that you will perhaps also be able to attend. This evening, we're going to be focusing on how a certain number of works or presentations can be perceived by the public and have quite violent reactions to this, and how museum professionals should react or not react in the light of this. And we will be questioning the role and place of museums in a context where we can see a weakening of traditionally representative institutions such as Parliament. And we're therefore looking for new fields of dialogue, sometimes for the best, sometimes for the worst. There's a lack of nuance sometimes, which can be at the heart of these debates. And that is why I think we need to strike a balance between the needs, yes, for museums to open up to these societal issues and debates which are legitimate, and some works can lead to debate, works that can open debate. Perhaps if we look at some of our older works, there is violence depicted within that, and yet there is no strong response to this. We see the aesthetic or historical qualities of it first and foremost. I think we also need to preserve the role of museums, which is to remain somewhat distanced from debate, to strike this balance between welcoming societal issues and also taking a step back. In museums, to have these spaces where we're having silence, and we don't have enough of this in our society. We're all bombarded by social media, images, sounds, and injunctions. We're constantly pulled in one direction or another. So how can we also keep museums as a refuge whilst also opening up to contemporary issues? And I think that this is a question alongside the one that we are going to be discussing today, and Émilie Girard will be presenting this to us presently. I would also like to thank our speakers, Cécile Debray, Emmanuelle, Lynda Knowles. And I would also like to give a special welcome to Malik Ndiaye, who is a curator at the Musée Théodore, monde, africain in Dakar. And we have led a number of actions for the preservation of collections in Africa, and their presentation in Senegal and beyond. Thank you to Dominique de Font-Réaulx for leading this evening and moderating tonight. And I'm sure that there will be moderated and moderate presentations this evening. It is a real honor to have you with us here in this amphitheatre this evening. I would like to hand over now to Émilie Girard for her introductory remarks. Thank you so much, Charles Personnaz, for your introduction. And I would also like to thank all of the teams at the INP who have helped organise this evening. Séverine Plena-Michel, who can't be here this evening, Émilie Môme, Olivier Zeder, who will be speaking at the end of the evening. And also thank you to the teams of the auditorium and the technical teams that have made this event possible. I'm delighted to see so many of you here and online for this first evening debate. The idea for this evening came about following the controversy surrounding the presentation of Miriam Khan's work, Fuck Abstraction, at the Palais de Tokyo about 1 year ago. And we saw that there were very strong reactions with a great deal of media coverage, particularly on social media. And this shows that we are now in a period where people feel like they have the right to speak out, and this is good. Now more than ever, museums are expected to take a stand on the works and artists they exhibit. We have to take a stand. Many of us receive calls from visitors alerting us to this or that work or artist whose display arouses emotions and reflections. Of course, museums are not the only ones in the cultural world to be exposed in this way. Literature, theatre, and cinema, I don't need to remind you of this, are also at the heart of debate. But what makes museums special is undoubtedly the fact that they are still mostly perceived as places of authority, credible institutions, a term that we've often used in recent months. And they are also places where people come together and exchange ideas and where debates can be encouraged. The new definition of museums reaffirmed, which was adopted in Prague, reaffirms that our institutions are at the service of society. Museums have a fundamental role to play in this increasingly lively and less nuanced public debate. At a time when some works of art are considered by some to be inappropriate, offensive, or immoral, it is more important than ever to remember that museums have a responsibility to move beyond the purely emotional component to provide input for understanding the world and putting it into perspective. I think we're all convinced that we need to be able to exhibit everything. The title of this evening is obviously rhetorical, but the question of how is at the heart of our questions. How do you exhibit works, objects, themes, or artists whose capacity to disturb or shock is well known or assumed? What discursive apparatus should museums make available to the public in order to better contextualize, explain, and respond to contradictions? Unfortunately, there is a technical issue. We are trying to resolve this as soon as possible. There is a technical issue with the sound from the auditorium. The organisers are being made aware currently. Our debates this evening are available in English, Spanish, and French. I would like to thank Ms. Schwartz and Mr. Michel, who are taking notes of the transcripts of our discussion so that they can be published quickly. And there are the latest minutes available from our debate on artificial intelligence in December of last year. So I would like to wrap up by wishing you all a pleasant and a beneficial evening. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. I hope that you can hear me. I hope the microphone is working. Thank you very much to Charles Personnaz and Émilie Girard for their welcome and this invitation. I'm really delighted and honored to be moderating this debate this evening. It really is, as they've said, a crucial issue today. This question of whether we can exhibit everything. As Charles Personnaz said, this takes us back to the role of museum in society today. We heard recently in a radio show that museums can't stand away from social issues and it needs to be connected into issues of society. But at the same time, the response that the museums are going to be able to provide are not short-term reactionary responses. It's more going to be about action, responses of action, creating context, shedding light on situations, bringing understanding and welcoming. And we've just heard from Émilie Girard the scandal around the exhibition by the work by Miriam Khan, Fuck Abstraction. It's very interesting what happened on the social media, but the judge in court decided that the work was presentable because it was open and because it had documents which explained the reason behind its presentation. So these documents were the explanatory panels associated with the exhibition. And so it was interesting that the justice system itself preserved the museum as a place of presentation, a place of temperance, a place of context. And I think this is one of the essential points that we'll talk about today, this role of museums when they have works that might challenge the sensibilities of different people. How can the museum be an actor and a declaratory actor? And the worst thing that could happen would be that it, as if nothing was happening. But what the museum needs to do is to act and to be involved in action. And we'll be talking with the panelists about this tonight. So there's a question of whether we can whether we can exhibit everything. And in fact, the question is, have we ever exhibited everything? Well, no, of course not. And of course, we deliberately chose this title for tonight, but this idea of exhibiting everything takes us back to the question of choice. There's always been choice within the museums. There's always been a choice about works that have been exhibited and others that haven't been exhibited. It's also interesting to consider what works haven't at a certain time were not acceptable at certain times. Nowadays we'd be happy to exhibit them, and now there are other ones that today we'd be less happy exhibiting. And so there are questions here. It's always been a question of choice made by museums. Objective choice, but also subjective choice. And I think this subjective aspect is important to remember. And there's also this question of narrative. And something we'll be talking about tonight is about how this narrative is developed, presented, communicated. That's also part of the role of museums. The position of museums today, and all museums actually, because these debates connect into questions of museums of society. They also, for some time already, have been impacting natural history museums and sociology museums since the second half of the 20th century. But now these questions are starting to impact fine art museums, which until recently wasn't really the case. Now there's an expectation in fine arts museums that works that are presented shouldn't just have a beautiful aesthetic, but they should also connect into something in society today. And I think that's a real opportunity for us. I don't think it's a problem, but a real opportunity. However, as Charles Personnaz said, it means that we have a narrow path to tread because we need to maintain who we are. We are one of the rare institutions today that still has a certain credibility. Museums still have a certain authority. But as we open up to dialogue and as we open up to including different audiences and to new discussions and debates, that's something that enables us to continue to maintain this status. And of course, there's this question that we're thinking about is how we can maintain this narrow path because actually here we're talking about something about the survival of museums. I was in Canada last week and one of my colleagues said to me, do you think that museums will continue? So I was thinking, well, of course, yes, of course. Museums are still surviving now, and of course they're going to live. But it's important to think about our death if we're going to exist. Well, that's true for museums, that is for human beings. Of course, my colleague didn't want museums to die, to come to an end, but what she was really saying is it possible for a museum that remains static to survive? And that's a very interesting question and something we should really take into consideration. If we don't exhibit everything, how do we do it? When we do exhibit, how should we do it? And how should we keep ourselves from entering into immediate reaction? Because in the reaction that there was in particular to the work of Miriam Khan, which is who's an artist I love very much, like so many of us, she really works on these questioning social issues, social questions, but sometimes the reactions that occurred were not always very healthy. They were very quick, speedy reactions. Sometimes we need to not respond too much to these immediate reactions that we encounter. And the justice system backed us up in this, in the need, there was no need to react so violently, as it were, to this question. So this evening we'll be here until 8:30 p.m. French time. You're very courageous to be with us for these 2 hours. Thank you very much for being with us. First, we're going to have an introduction from Emmanuelle Lallement, who's an anthropologist and a professor at the University of Paris 8 and has worked with the Ministry of Culture. And then we're going to have presentations from each of our guest speakers, and I'll be introducing them as they come to the microphone. Cécile Debray, Émilie, Malik, Ndiaye, Camille Faucourt, and Lynda Knowles as well, who are with us on Zoom. Each of you will speak for about 10 minutes, and then there'll be time for discussion and debate between us, and then, of course, with everyone who's present here. I will mention this again later, but in order for things to operate well, whenever you speak, take the microphone, please do say who you are, just your name and your position. That's really important for our debates, but also for the transcription of the proceedings that's currently being developed. So I'm now going to hand over to Emmanuelle Lallement, who's a professor at the University of Paris 8 and who's carrying out a lot of interesting work with the Institute of European Studies. And she also led the audience department at the Ministry of Culture, and we worked together a lot at that time, and she's going to be talking about the symbolic role of museums as institutions. So we're looking forward to hearing this. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. So I'm, of course, delighted to be with you once again and to meet you again to talk about this social role of museums, which is, of course, something which was the focus of a number of, quite a lot of our work at the Ministry of Culture in France, and was linked to something that we've been working on in the ministry for some time. I'd also like to thank ICOM, whose work I'm really following, for the way in which they're engaging with this public debate and talking about this question of what museums are. And I think that's really very interesting, and I'm very enthusiastic about this all. And I'm delighted to be back in this auditorium as well, which of course has so many memories for me. So Dominique just asked me to do a little bit of an introduction, perhaps as an anthropologist rather than a museum specialist, because I am not a museum specialist like you are. But it's true that this question of whether we can exhibit everything or not, I actually don't think it is so rhetorical. Yes, there is a rhetorical aspect to that, but we can go beyond that, I think. And it's a question that's really at the heart of what museums are, and at the heart of a debate around our social modes, the question of how we operate and conflict within society. And indeed, this is something we heard from Émilie Girard in her presentation, an invitation to the event. So perhaps just some reflections as an anthropologist. Anthropology is a discipline where we are always trying to decenter, look elsewhere, look earlier in time, and perhaps look in a different way. Often we try to take a different approach while we're also looking at very evident and obvious things, but we're not always aware of what's happening. So looking at perhaps a different perspective on life and asking some deeper questions and perhaps some more specific questions about museums. So the first thing I want to say is really a question which perhaps seems very obvious. And the question is exhibiting, is that what museums are about? Is exhibiting really at the heart of the reason for existence of a museum? And so, of course, this is a question that is asked in particular about museums, the question that we're asking tonight. Of course, museums exhibit works. Human activity leaves material traces. Sometimes these traces are involuntary. Anthropologists talk about, for example, in the Chauvet cave, the footprints that were undoubtedly involuntary. Others are artifacts, intentional acts. So the paintings on the wall of these caves, and then some of them, of course, can be seen in natural environments, in landscapes, but others are represented by fragments of objects or objects. So these are things that are collectible, that can be moved, can be stored, and can then be exhibited. But museums are not the sanctuary of all of this. In a world that is full of objects, we have an abundance of objects in our world today, and an abundance in particular of commercial objects. So we're actually in something of a saturation of objects. So we really can't think about exhibition in museums without thinking about the opposite, which is commercial exhibition in shops. And that's something that's really interesting to me, making a connection between the commercial world and the museum world, and seeing that once again there's an abundance and there's a saturation, and you can see this through the economy of stacking has become a real economy. So now, for example, there are so many shops, as many shops that are developed and in place for providing us with storage solutions, as many as those that want to sell things for us to present and store. So it's all about presenting objects. And I think this is one of the statuses of objects in our society. This is one of the ways that we treat and handle objects in our society. Sometimes we put them in shops, sometimes we put them in museums, sometimes we sell them, sometimes we present them. This is all exhibiting, and all of this creates the status of objects. And when we think about selling objects, we're talking about commercial seduction, because of course the commercial world is the world of seduction. So this gives the object a particular aspect. But we can't really think about the world of museums and their role today without thinking about the invasion of the commercial world. During the COVID lockdowns, I was invited to take part in development of a white paper around shows and the living world, performance in the living world. And I was thinking about institutions and the natural world, and I was thinking about the paradox about how is it that we are in a society where we feel more relaxed in a supermarket, a hypermarket, than in a museum or a theatre. How is it that shops and stores give us that feeling that we can come and go as we like, more than cultural venues? How can it be that these stores, even luxury stores, are less intimidating than museums? How is it that we feel more legitimate in the world of merchandise than in the museum world? And I think we have delegated to non-cultural spaces, we have delegated legitimacy and space, the right to be present as a citizen. And I think this is something in all these commercial areas that we are saturated with. I think that this takes away somewhat from the cultural institutions. But the privileged connection that we have with objects is immersion. In all areas, immersion in crowds. Visitors are part of the space and design. We create density, and commercial spaces, they manage to do this. They create a privileged connection with objects, this connection by immersion. Of course, there's the world of exhibitions, and the act of exhibiting, I think, is also wider than museums. Since most of human history, we've exhibited men and women, inventions, nations, national constructions, colonial histories, particularly in the universal shows, the world fairs. And then in 1893, the Chicago World Fair was one of the organizations during this period of imperialism and colonialism. And in this massive exhibition launched by the colonial powers, the whole world was sampled down. So when the commercial world is in these exhibitions, we end up in a kind of euphoria of bazaars, and a euphoria of everything and nothing at all. And in the other world, we're in dysphoria and discrimination. That's, I mean, in the sense of discerning and distinguishing between things, but also within the meaning of discrimination, which means separating out a human group from other human groups by treating it worse than others. So a lot has been written about this exhibition. I'm thinking about the work of Philip Hammond in the 1980s, which talked about exhibitions in the 19th century, which was really struck by kind of this acute exhibitionitis. And he picked up this term about exhibitions being a delirium of the 19th century. And I would say that in this particular specific connection between the visible and the invisible, between the everything, the totality and selection, between the chaos of reality and the organization into categories, and therefore the violence of categorization, because categorization is generally not only a categorization, but also a creation of a hierarchy. And then, of course, there's the idea of exhibitions, the notion of ideas and the world of ideas. And I think all of this connects into this question of whether we can exhibit everything that we're looking at tonight. And then, of course, is the question of exhibiting oneself. We are always exhibiting ourselves. In the reign of images and the dissemination of images, it's perhaps this question of exhibiting oneself that's still present. But exhibiting oneself also means that you're taking a risk. You're exposing yourself to something. And you presented this very emblematic example that we heard earlier, but also the example of degradation of works through polemic. We can see that the exhibition of works in museums creates in someone the idea of exhibiting themselves, of taking a risk, of going to this stage that is the stage of a museum in order to act and say something. So I think there's an extension of the domain of exhibition and the act of exhibiting that we need to understand in this new connection with the abundance of objects and images. And so the work of an anthropologist is not just to create distinct universes or worlds, but to show the relatedness of aspects between these different worlds, because actually this relatedness is really quite striking. Comparing a museum to a shopping center is a bit iconoclastic, but I think it's something that needs to be done, because what I can see at the moment is that shopping centers exhibit works of arts. People that own them are also connected into people owning luxury hotels around the world, and there's the totality approach of museums, and this totality of exhibition is going to help us to understand what we will see in the future, is that we can see works of arts within luxury hotels, for example. So this takes us back to this question that museums are saying, can we exhibit everything, even though everyone is exhibiting everything? And museums should feel legitimate in terms of exhibiting. I think when we're saying, can everything be exhibited, I don't think it's just an ethical question, but it's also a question of what's possible or what's impossible. We are facing real questions of what's possible and what's impossible, and to what extent. That's why we're connecting in can we with how can we tonight. It's not the same question, but these are really tied in together. I think the fact that of going into a museum, it changes something, even in our society, which is not very connected into museums today. In museums, we have places that don't do things any old way. And that's what's so important about museums and the specific activity. So it's true, as Dominique was saying earlier, that this is an opportunity to speak about how important these places are. Museums as institutions are really very important places, and they have a real responsibility. I would say, in comparison with other cultural and educational establishments, I believe that we are now requiring a lot of museums. People say that we're requiring a lot of schools, and the schools should fix everything, but I think we're also requiring a lot of museums and cultural institutions. And I think that within these cultural institutions, we're asking more of museums than other cultural institutions. I don't think we have the same requirements of opera or other cultural institutions. I think the museums are being required to do more. I think this is to do with the power of the place, but also the power of speech. It's true that there's something of authority in what museums say, and in the different public surveys that we did around satisfaction and how visitors perceived exhibitions, there was always something in in the fact that what was presented in the museum, it was undeniable. What is said in a museum is undeniable. It has authority. And this is something that perhaps is intimidating, but also very reassuring, because we are reassured to have an undeniable word, because in a context where even science is questioned, undeniability is really very important. So we end up with a double pressure on institutions, on museums. They need to have an originality in order to give strength to its speech, to its message, but at the same time, it needs to be constantly being renewing. So it needs to be conserving and renewing at the same time. So perhaps this is what, in order to do this, we need to develop a new kind of speech, or a new speech. Here we're not talking about narrative, but what I understand, what I mean by speech and word, it's all about an invitation to reciprocity. I'm really giving a speech now, but later we'll be hearing from others. But the idea of speech, what I mean is a two-way communication. People say, I'm going to speak now, we're going to invite such and such to speak, or I'm going to take over the speech now at this point. And I think in museums, we often talk these days about going to meet works, not seeing works, but meeting works. So we're talking about relationship with audiences, relationships with works, reciprocity. So I think what museums are perhaps being reproached. The reproach that we're seeing of museums is actually the silence of museums. It's not when museums speak that they're reproached, but when there's silence. And indeed, law backed this up, the justice system backed this up in the particular situation we were talking about earlier with Miriam Khan. When there's a deafening silence, there is actually an opportunity to speak clearly. So before coming here, I read the article of Naomi, which talked about museums as socially living museums. I invite you to read this article, which talks about a social world full of engagement, and it's impossible for museums to stay retreated away from the chaos of the world. And she talks about life. She talks about socially living museums, questions that are socially vibrant. Of course, there's this question of vitality as opposed to death or eternity or fixation. There's energy on one side, and on the other side, there's something that's just fixed in time. And all of this in a world that's full of reactions, sensitivity, loud, rapid judgments and responses. We're in this kind of very sensitive society when we have images that come over other images or words that come on top of other words. I think we're not really focused here on sensitivity. I think when we use those kind of terms, we're depreciating the reality somewhat, when actually these questions are fundamental identity questions rather than sensitivity questions, because they're questions that are around identity and what defines someone, a group or a community. And even though no individual can be reduced to an identity, or no community can be reduced to a single identity, but we live in a society where identity is a tactical trick to use in a social game. And since we're in this situation where we're focused in on not sensitivities, but identity, I think this question of whether everything can be exhibited, about whether there are things that are that cannot be exhibited, becomes an identity question. Dominique said this. Things that used to be able to be exhibited can no longer be exhibited. I think there is change. There's also regression. That is a reality. There is a real moving back and forward. We're not in an evolutionary world where we're seeing constant progress. We're more in a circularity where we see things coming back, not disappearing. I think there's always been a real enthusiasm for what has not been exhibited, because there's always been an interest in what happens backstage, what happens behind the scenes. That's always something that's been very attractive. And I think that all of this raises questions for us. And I think this is something that I find particularly interesting, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, because perhaps what can be exhibited by one particular museum cannot be exhibited by others, just as one person might be able to exhibit such and such a thing and someone else might not be able to. And perhaps what's important here is not to speak for other people, because the museums that are concerned or affected by the specific situation should be the ones that are speaking, and we should perhaps avoid speaking on behalf of others. I think we're at a point where museums are coming to this very stimulating, very interesting period where museums need to be a stage without constantly calling on the backstory of its museum, this question of the people that decide what can be exhibited and what can't be exhibited, who decide what culture is appropriate for different people. So That's what I've got to say, really. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, because these are really very open questions and de-centered questions that I'm really asking, and I'm really looking forward to taking part in that this evening.
Thank you so much, Emmanuelle, and thank you for this comparison that you had with the supermarket. It's also about abundance, and perhaps if we're daring to go into a luxury shop, it's because if we have enough money, we can actually buy something and go home with it. Whereas museums are a place where appropriation, taking ownership of something, is always more complex, and it needs to be supported. It's like this concept of speech and being able to speak. This is something that's taken and given, and I think that these are very interesting points that we're going to explore together now. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Cécile Debray, who is president of the Picasso Museum, and previously working in the Boulangerie Museum and in the Pompidou Center as a curator on a number of high quality exhibitions at the Picasso Museum, a global artist, almost in a plural sense, representing multiple molds, and very talented, but so very contested as well. I know that some people are always afraid to show their Picasso works in case their adaptations are done better in the future. So there are a lot of questions associated with this, and I know that you work with the life and works of Picasso. They are linked to Picasso itself, and this is something that Cécile has mentioned in a number of projects that she's been working on. So we're looking forward to hear from you about how you've been able to think within the Picasso Museum internally and then also externally, and how these reflections on presenting an artist like Picasso can be done, and what you've been thinking about in recent days and the collections being presented from today. So yes, it's since today that this exhibition that's been available. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Cécile Debray. Thank you so much, Dominique. Thank you for this invitation. This question, can we exhibit everything? I feel that when we're talking about a monographic dominant artist, like we are very dominant on the art market, is the number one artist in terms of sales still to this day. And this is unusual as the figure is very debated and there are a lot of questions associated with him. But on the art market, in any case, this is still very much the height of his fame, and this has been true for many decades now. So he's very dominant in contemporary exhibitions around the world. Generally, this is one of the blockbuster figures, if we can call it that way. So if we want a high footfall exhibition, we know that we'll be able to attract them through a Picasso work. Yet this may be changing. And I think one thing that I can nuance is about whether or not he's still a dominant figure. So yes, he is very dominant in the history of art. Is he still dominant in universities? And I think that this question is starting to be raised. And I know that there are a lot of students and young professionals here listening today. And this is a question that I'm working on a lot and that we're working on as curators within this monographic museum focused solely on Picasso. So I'm going to be telling you a little bit more concretely what we're doing and how I've addressed my mission within the Picasso Museum. I arrived just over 2 years ago now. And when I left the Orangerie Museum, I went to the Picasso Museum during a time of Me Too. And this was a real shock because as soon as I'd set foot inside this museum and met a few journalists who were reporting on my arrival in the museum, I see many of you here today, this evening, and I know that you were alongside me when I was working with the Pompidou Center, and these were fans that are quite well identified. But then people are asking me questions about, well, how can you work with a misogynist artist, an artist who raped people, an artist who instrumentalized African art as well? There were a lot of things that people asked me. And when I met the curators at this museum, and it's not pejorative what I'm going to say, but I felt that there was a little bit of people were lost somewhat. We were lost between our number one missions, which were about passing down heritage and promoting heritage. I think that's how we can define our number one role as museum curators. But also alongside this, there was this need to respond and to react, to take on board, perhaps sometimes ignore. And so the question is, what are we going to do in the light of this debate? I'd just had an experience that had been very enriching in terms of reflection on our professions as well. This collective exhibition on Black figures in the Musée d'Orsay, when we were thinking about ourselves, first of all. If we're all white people and so we were born into relative wealth, are we the best professionals to be discussing this? What was the terminology that we should be using for the different titles? And we were really calling into question our position, decentering ourselves and considering the question of history, the history of exhibition, the history of collections. So my first reflex was to say that we were going to need to take a moment, that we would need to have an internal seminar of some sorts between ourselves. So all staff at the museum, including security guards and curators. And we're going to meet up every month and have key figures and thinkers and professionals from the world of museums and art and culture in order to get an overview of all of the debate and organize discussions on the question of violence, sexuality, historiography, the painter and his muse, that whole relationship, and also post-colonialism. But I know that Malik has been invited to take part in these discussions as well. And the question of museum in itself. So we conducted these debates throughout the year. We invited Mariam Khan before even there was this incident. And we invited her to speak with Marie-Laure Bernadac. And this was a lively debate. It was surprising. We saw feminists of the 70s generation showing a form of incomprehension when faced with the young female students who were in a much more radical stance, almost up to this idea of no longer showing this stuff and rejecting it. And this was a real exciting debate with Miriam Khan, who really did stir everybody up. And I was surprised at this, actually. And in real life, she really doesn't let people walk all over her. And there was a real liveliness in debate, and perhaps some of the students here today were also there at this event. So debates did not give us answers. And that was not the purpose in any case. I think it's very difficult to give answers to all of these questions. But first and foremost, we wanted to position the museum as a place that welcomes debate. I'd asked Orlan to come and show a series on Picasso. This was a way of showcasing dialogue between the museum's stance and a feminist artist's stance. This included all of the debates as art historians and Picasso professionals found a little bit characterized, because we have these debates quite often. So here we had the vision of the dying Dorama, who was martyrized by Picasso, that Picasso is painting after hitting her. I'm characterizing it. It's a bit of a caricature what I'm doing here, but in any case, she decided to put herself in the place of this woman crying and gave feminist discourse to this. We are showing this. So there is a gesture welcoming this in and supporting the message. But we reminded the Civil War, the historical context, without taking any specific stance, without adding an interpretation on this work. We're just trying to set a historical context. And once again, this is our role. This is where we can have an authority with this accusatory perspective on Picasso as well. And I think it's healthy to have that within the museum. So we did all of this work for a year. I started to schedule women artists in our program with this example of Orlan. It's very difficult. I did an exhibition on Beltus, and with Beltus, we need to think about the pseudo-pedophilia. This is still a delicate issue. And I'd asked an artist who knew Beltus quite well to address these issues through artwork. I felt that it was easier to do this rather than to take a stance of judgment or interpretation on something that is actually extremely complex. We want to be able to show Beltus's work. I believe that it's important. So this is an example. I think that the role of artists is one of a real accomplice with us. That's how I consider it. When we talk about the Louvre, for instance, the role of contemporary artists within the Louvre since its creation has been key. And I think that this voice of contemporary artists really does allow us to have debate with different perspectives at different levels. And I think this is better accepted, and it's also easier for curator teams. And then the power of the artist also carries authority. So there are two authorities here, and I think they find virtue within dialogue, and there is a real advantage for us in this. So it's about working with our teams, thinking about the historiography of Picasso, which is very interesting. Please do tell me if I need to wrap up. But one really interesting aspect is to show how art historians who wrote about Picasso often projected their fantasies of masculinity. I'm not saying that Picasso did not play a very active role in his way of being violent, perhaps even a bit crazy when it came to his relationships with women. But there is a historiographical work where people have somehow taken the work of Picasso and aligned it with his romantic life. And this is a fantastical approach from art historians, and these were often men. There is a kind of deconstruction of historiography, which is very important. This is an interesting avenue for development. And this has led us to a conclusion, which was to say to younger students that you now need to write this history. The works are here with all of their complexity, all of their depth, and strength as well. But this art history is something that art historians now need to take on and rewrite. They need to carry it. There's a message that is really focused on the future. Perhaps to wrap up quickly now, debate was also achieved through our program. We had Sophie Calle come recently, who took the place of Picasso. This was very symbolic. While we were celebrating the anniversary of his death, she came to the Picasso Museum for 3 months. We worked closely with her, and she really played the role in questioning Picasso's death and also the disappearance of some works, etc. And she was really able to play a very interesting role in this. It was very exciting to see this exhibition was very successful. It was very well received. And we could talk about self-censorship in shortly, perhaps. It was quite a radical approach. We could imagine that there would have been a lot of attacks about the fact that we removed some of the Picasso works. She would say, I've taken the Picassos and I've hidden them in the basement, but it wasn't necessarily that. There were perhaps some tourists who showed up looking for specific works who were disappointed. This is not something that can last a long time, obviously, but it does give space for debate. And it's a way of bringing in new audiences as well. It is very difficult to talk about everything in just a few minutes, but it was a way of drawing in new audiences to the Picasso Museum. Sophie Calle has her own audience, and they came. And today we've just opened up the collection. We've rehung the collection, and here we tried as a Festringel, a Black American artist who was in close dialogue with Picasso, perhaps we'll have the opportunity to talk about this. It gave us the opportunity to talk about the role of Picasso in the renaissance of art and the relationship with African art. And we'd need a lot of time to talk about all of this. But everything that we did over the past 2 years has been underpinned by our attempt to build ties between this collective work in hanging of the works. And it's really interesting to see how journalists have received this new collection launch. The reviews have been generally positive in the press, and everybody noticed this tribute room that we have for François Gillot. François Gillot, I saw that one journalist mentioned this. François Gillot had been blacklisted by Picasso's class and school, and in the US as well. There's this artist who has her own audience and is accepted in France. However, she's still viewed as this person who called out Picasso in the 1960s. And so I'm very surprised to see the enthusiasm. I'm not surprised, as I imagined that it would be successful, but I can see that this gesture, this small gesture, this small room appears to have been a cornerstone in the reconstruction, the rehanging. And I think this is built on work that's been carried out over several months. The return of the person who had been exiled, perhaps. There's the question of a monographic museum, of whether we always need to do Picasso. Obviously, I think that we need to open up a little bit broader. So having the collection hung across 3 upper levels now will mean that we're able to have permanent exhibitions that show us other works than Picasso, so that we can discuss the reception of Picasso. We've done Festringo, but we're also going to show Faucourt's early years, and we're going to show some female artists, always linked to Picasso. We're lucky because Picasso is the dominant figure of the 20th century, so there are a number of pretexts to discuss this. I do really believe in this opening with a monographic museum working on a collection in detail with the focus points and airing it out a little bit, giving us opportunities to explore modern art and also have contemporary installations, etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this excellent work, which has really been interesting to watch this work over the last couple of years. What's really interesting is that you talked about historiography, taking another narrative of art history. I think that's also the role of museums. Museums are not the receptacle of art history, but it also contributes to its development. And I think it's really very interesting to see this aspect, to see this perspective and the context, to see how the history of the art of Picasso was written with very subjective perspectives, which developed a very specific vision of the artist. And there's also, you've mentioned the place given to female artists, which is something that's really very important, not just because they're talented, but also because it helps to give a context for Picasso in his time. So it's one of the ways in which we can maintain this necessary authority of museums while also opening it up and leaving room for other narratives. I'm going to hand on over to Malik Ndiaye, who is Doctor in Art History and creator of the Musée Théodore d'Art in Dakar. He was also the curator for the Picasso exhibition in Dakar, so he knows the artist very well, and he does a lot within his museum. Just as we've heard from Cécile Debray, you also give space for artists within your museum. And so I'm going to hand over to you because your vision in Africa is, of course, an African vision, but it's also a much more universal vision in comparison with other things going on elsewhere. And I think that's really very interesting. And this, of course, raises questions about what can be exhibited today in Africa, which couldn't be before, but which cannot be exhibited in Africa now. And that's going to be really interesting to hear from you. Thank you. Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. Of course, I would first of all just like to start by thanking ICOM France for inviting me and Dominique for including me in this meeting. I'm really delighted to be here at the INP, which is like a second home for me. I came out of here in 2012 and I've maintained relationships with the Institute and with colleagues here. And so I'm really doubly delighted to talk about this question because it's a question that we do encounter within our museum. It's a university museum focused on research and cultural mediation and also in partnership and opening up to the world. And I'd perhaps like to approach this question by focusing on communities. We could talk about groups or societies. But about this question about whether we should exhibit everything, I'd like to take an approach of looking at communities who create objects and which have ended up connected into what we call universal museums. A lot of things have happened for these communities now to be at the heart of the debate. We are in a context where history is more and more contested, and these specific histories are full of strategies of reappropriation of narratives. And what's happening in the context of museums is that because museums conserve heritage, through this heritage, societies see themselves, imagine themselves, and develop themselves. This is connected also into a movement that we've seen in the last years where there is critical literature which is deeply anchored in post-colonial narratives, which is another category, and they are re-evaluating this history, talking about the encounters between peoples at the intersection of colonialism and imperialism, and this history has developed a lot of heritage that has been collected, pillaged sometimes, and spread now all around the world. So these communities are connected into these questions, and it's connected into the history of museums that we call ethnographic museums that have objects, artifacts that we consider are called ethnographic artifacts. Actually, that's not the case. They are seen from an ethnographic approach. They're not actually ethnographic artifacts, to be precise. But these museums of society, ethnographic museums, have developed a lot all around the world, in Germany, France, Belgium, the US. There's a kind of development of these museums with artifacts that present a particular aesthetic and a particular narrative developed around these kind of objects. Communities have also been challenged around debates on human remains. This is a very sensitive issue, as we all know, because it connects into the question of soul, identity of society, and societies that see within these artifacts, in inverted commas, because we can't really call them artifacts, but perhaps these are rather subjects. When I was in Benin and I was talking with colleagues and some people who are really involved in the worship of ancestors, they were talking about the question of repatriation of works. They were saying that they're not artifacts, but these are they're not things, but these are subjects. These are have personality, as it were. And we need to understand that these artifacts are not just simple materials, they're the extension of community bodies. Within African situations, many works of arts carried spirits, they communicated spirits. So for these communities, they're not materials, they're the extensions of community bodies. And for a number of reasons today, these communities have the right to speak about how objects should be exhibited and whether they are exhibited, whether they're authorized to be exhibited. Because what museums do with these artifacts, these objects, is that once they're in their collection, they no longer refer to the communities where these objects come from. And today, we can see the development of ethnographic museums. We can see this question of human remains, and all of this none of this can be disconnected from the new definition of museum adopted by ICOM in Prague. And this ethics code that is being revised, in fact, in Article 4 of the ethics code, the ICOM ethics code, I saw a sentence that says museums must ensure that the information they present in their exhibitions are founded, exact, and take into consideration the beliefs and groups represented. And within the same ethics code, on the 6th recommendation, museums work closely with communities from which come the collections and the collections they serve. What does that mean? We can have the impression that increasingly, and here I'm paraphrasing Leland Snoop, who talked about conservation versus presentation. Here, perhaps museums are required to converse with the communities where objects come from. This is something that is fundamental, something that is vital for the survival of museums, at least for these museums. But we are faced perhaps not with a dilemma, but with a serious challenge, because we can have this impression that today the character, the universal character of museums, which is profoundly rooted in the Enlightenment and the contextual environment of museums, it seems that this is being challenged by a multiplicity of points of view, of societies, contexts, sensitivities, ways of experiencing the institution. And so there's a responsibility on the part of curators who are facing a dilemma in which museums need to find a balance between the need of knowledge, the need for knowledge. Seeing is knowing, as we heard. which might run against the aspirations of communities. So we face a dilemma here. Museums are spaces where we know things and we learn, a space for science, knowledge, but also a space that needs to take into account the sensitivities, or at least the profile or identity of a given group that have the right to determine what happens to the objects that are exhibited, because this heritage is a pretext for connecting into a history, for constructing a representation and memory, and connecting into the notion of existence. So freedom of expression versus the need to understand and to know. I think that this means that we have a responsibility as curators and conservators. We have a responsibility, perhaps underscored and strengthened by the fact that on the African continent where I am, we are facing societies that are disconnected from their heritage because geographies have changed, cultures have developed, even the meanings and significations of such and such an object have changed. When we return to the space that created it, sometimes the meaning of these objects have changed, but nevertheless, it is a object of heritage. It is part of history. It's part of our traditions. It is part of a projection into the future. And we are a repository of this, and we have the responsibility to conserve it, to present it, and to communicate about it to other generations. So we can have two issues here. The first issue is, how can we develop a new professional team? How can we handle these objects? The second challenge is, how can we reconnect objects and artifacts? How can we reconnect these heritages, particularly when we talk about heritage connect into questions of restitution as well? How can we reconnect this heritage with the communities? This is a fundamental question and a real challenge today. And it raises lots of other questions. The repercussions are that museums are becoming spaces of battle, where battle lines are drawn and redrawn about different ways in which we interpret heritage in different and new contexts in order to try and connect them into a society. So what does that mean? Does that mean that museums can remain this space? I'm coming back to this idea of seeing is knowing. Can museums be places that tell the truth, where the truth is not contested? A space where there is not a single truth to present, where the curator doesn't have the final word, but a space which opens up to a multiplicity of narratives that are not necessarily authorized narratives, the narratives of scientists, but narratives that come from other backgrounds. How can we make museums a space where knowledge is co-developed, where curators and the scientists, the person responsible for the institution, is a facilitator, where they give these objects and collections the opportunity to have multiple lives and to be open to a whole number of different movements, which are not trying to develop a single truth, but give rise and give room to a number of different possibilities. And these different possibilities will perhaps come together. Right now, at that point, this scientific and cultural project, should it not become a social project? So when we write a project to say, this is the vision of the museum, This is the place that a museum must have from a scientific and cultural perspective within a society. This becomes a project, a social project, because once again, as we've already heard, producing an exhibition in Dakar is not the same thing as an exhibition in Texas or an exhibition in Saudi Arabia. We're not touching on the same questions. We can't engage with the same questions. Whatever we are intending to do, we're going to end up with different questions because museums are connected into social projects, social and political questions. So I think that in the 21st century today, with everything that has been going on with the questions of restitution that are challenging us, we need to start thinking about the nature and the missions and the role of curators and that we have as museums, and the nature and the missions of museums. At least at our museum, and I will wrap up with this, our goal is to make sure that the museum is an experiential museum, a museum that thinks and facilitates thinking, that invites artists to dialogue and to co-create with us. And this is why for the next Dakar Biennium, we are going to present an exhibition with 5 universities, which comes from a research project called, and we've developed this with Bénédicte Savoy, Tirage Rasoul from a university in Cape Town, Dan X from the Pitts River Museum, and others with 5 postdoctoral students, and we're working together to develop arguments that might make it possible to reconnect heritage with and collections with communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Malik, for this really fascinating presentation. When you say that museums need to be a place of struggle, of combat, and not armed combat, but a place of discussion. Also, this question of experimental museums, I think this is essential. And this relationship to intent, where objects come from. Lynda Knowles will be discussing this later on, as this is something that's still ongoing in the US at the moment with this new law requiring indigenous communities to be consulted on the exhibition of certain objects that we'll be talking to her later on. So first of all, we're going to hand over to Camille Faucourt, who is currently in Marseille and is heritage curator at Mucem and co-curator with in 2012 of a previous exhibition called Abd El Kader alongside Florence Udovic, and currently is co-curator of an exhibition called Another World History. So it's very interesting to hear from her regarding her scientific approach, but also her approach to visitors. This really has overthrown our way of presenting things, the cartographical presentations particularly. Europe was not at the center of the world in previous cartologies. And I thought it was really interesting, this idea of the role given to visitators, not just through cultural mediation, but through museography, the installation of works, and the rhythm of the scenography. So over to you, Camille, to discuss these projects. If you could just talk 10 to 12 minutes so that we can leave some time for discussions later on. Thank you so much for being here this evening. And thank you very much to ICOM France for this invitation. I will seek to comply with the short time frame as far as possible. I'm going to be talking about a case study that I've been working on over the past 4 years, this co-curatorship with a historian and a geographer for this exhibition entitled Une autre histoire du monde, another world history. And as Malik and Ndiaye mentioned, the idea at the heart of this project was to question a model of museums that my co-curators had designed as this idea of universal encyclopedic museums. And this is contested now. And this has helped the West to showcase a real narrative of the world where Europe was at the heart and also the driver of this narrative, which we then imposed at a global scale from the 18th century onwards. So the public now and professionals in our Western museums, we are filled with these imaginations, these imaginaries where Europe is at the center of the world, where we've standardized events and actors according to thought categories that are far from universal. And we've internalized them to the extent that they feel major now. In this exhibition, we wanted to showcase this project of decentering and taking our perspective away from Europe at the center. And we didn't want to present just one other history of the world, but other histories in the plural on the basis of non-European collections. And the ownership methods and them being exhibited at museums is even under threat at the moment. So the historian really worked on the epistemology, and European museums are really starting to work on this now and replacing their collections within a more contextualized environment. This exhibition required 4 years of work. There was a very large size. Here we wanted to exhibit works from across the 5 continents with collections in France and overseas, ethnographic museums, historical museums, libraries, art museums, private collections. And so the choice was made to conceptualize the exhibition with a number of workshops as well to explore the issues with artists, anthropologists, geographers, other museum professionals, our colleagues, authors, in order to work together to think about what this exhibition could be, how we could embody this concept, this question, and to share our different knowledge through a transdisciplinary approach and a geographical approach. In this exhibition, the works were majoritarily not from the West. Europe is present, but marginally with a few reference objects. We use it as a starting point before we veer off in another direction with our visitors. We've used source objects, archives that can be at the heart of an alternative ethnography and a modern interpretation through tangible and intangible heritage available through sound installations. We actually have oral traditions that are used now as potential sources for historians. So we allowed visitors to hear 4 different oral traditions from New Caledonia, Brazil, Morocco, and another location alongside an ethnomuseologist, anthropologist, citing the sources, the methods of transmission, how this was handed down through the generations. This exhibition will be closing on Monday, and it includes 150 works from Africa, Oceania, the Americas, Europe, and Asia. And our stance of being a decentered could perhaps appear to be a paradox, as it was held at the Mucem, the Museum of Mediterranean and European Civilizations, and a lot of the objects exhibited were obtained through colonialization, which raised a lot of questions about this tangible heritage and how it was obtained. Dominique has mentioned this, and I would like to come back to this now. We really believe that it was crucial to think far in advance with a great scenography team called Casen. We wanted to think about the clarity of our discourse, the museology, with a real focus on making our decentralized approach, how we needed to reconstitute very varied historical contexts. This is not a chronological approach, but a really fragmented approach to history through objects. We wanted to give our visitors as many tools as possible so that our variety of publics can understand these objects much like a historian would do in front of archaeological objects. We were working with curators, the public departments, and museologists in order to promote this decentered approach. We wanted to engage our visitors in a bodily way. It was very simple how we did this, but we had a title, for instance, which was presented on its side, so people had to twist their heads to see it. And we also had something that needed to be deciphered. We wanted to partially hide a work, a monumental work from le Louvre. And it's a real edifice to Napoleonic era. And the whole world is represented by allegories, with the jest of the emperor at the heart of this. This is a didactic and symbolic work showing French history and Europe, which then taught history to the rest of the world. So right from the start, we wanted to perhaps distort our visitors' perspective by partially hiding this work behind a window, which allowed us to give an analytical approach to this work of art. This is a very large work as well of a world map as well. And in order to engage our visitors in this corporal bodily visit, later on in the exhibition, there are a series of showcases where we keep some empty. We ask a number of questions to visitors, and we encourage them to go into this this display case themselves in order to experience for themselves what it means to be showcased in a museum, what we're trying to show through the exhibition. When we showcase an exhibition, something a work in an exhibition, something happened. This is an experience that a lot of visitors tried. It did make some people uncomfortable. And it was, however, quite effective as a system. Our quirky approach was also reflected in the signs beneath the works. There was the systematic inclusion of the decentered planisphere, the Fuller method. This is the world organized in 20 triangles, which ensures that there is no top, no bottom. And it allows us to bring everybody together. And through the museum signs, we were already disrupting visitors. And this was quite easy to use. And we had the same idea to show this on all of the museum signs
in the United States,
with a comparison between the Gregorian calendar and also calendars corresponding to the location of the works, and we paid a lot of attention to the original languages in which the works were created as well, making sure that we showed them. I will be wrapping up my presentation shortly. The second important point was to make it as accessible as possible, these different histories and stories behind the objects. We wanted to provide the context systematically through a number of methods, particularly visual and graphic methods with infographics, over 12 of them. Throughout the exhibition, these were used for deciphering and understanding the works, and particularly the pictorial and cartographic aspects. It would have been very difficult to decipher without the tools that we provided. Around 4 key works in the exhibition, we had focus sections of 10 to 15 square meters with the biographical information related to works. So this is located throughout the exhibition, these hybrid works that were very important with the different interpretations from the West, the African continent, and also Asia, Oceania, and America. We clearly wanted to include on each museum sign a paragraph about the origin of the work since its creation right up until it entered the collection and where it's been exhibited in different institutions, when it's been public property and private property. We wanted to tell the story of all of the works. Finally, right from the start, we wanted to have an empty display case. This is something that we see in a number of contemporary exhibitions and museums. This can evoke the absence of art that has been taken away, and this tangible culture, material culture that's exploding at the moment, and we're trying to conserve it as humanity. But there's also a lot of gaps and omissions that have impacted these collections, and we think it's important to remind our visitors of this. I'm going to stop my presentation now. It was very brief, and I would just like to say that by paying attention to visitors, we've able to collect data from the public and from some categories of visitor in order to measure the impact of the museographical systems used and to check their validity and efficiency. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much for this presentation. As you described the museographical procedures, you it's not actually really very easy to be exhibited in a museum. And this is really very interesting. What was also really interesting is that in your exhibition, you showed works that are today presentable, but before they were not worthy of exhibition. So it shows the change that's happened here. So without further delay, we're going to hand over to Lynda Knowles, who's delighted to be with us. We're delighted to have her with us from Colorado. I'm speaking in French, but she's translated into English. She is Colorado Deputy County Attorney, but she was for a long time a legal manager for the Fine Arts Museum in Denver. She's also a member of ICOM, and I'm delighted that she can take part in our evening this evening to talk about something I mentioned earlier, which is the implementation of a federal law that was put in place in January in the US as a further step in a number of laws that have been put in place since 2010 that require American museums to ask the question of communities where artifacts come from to do with human remains, but also other objects, to find out whether communities give the authorization for them to be exhibited. The idea of this law is to make sure there's this kind of conversation that Malik was talking about with communities. But the effect has been that for the moment that most of these objects have been withdrawn because there was no prior agreement for most museums. And so this raised a number of questions in terms of relationship with exhibition, even though our colleague from the New York Natural History Museum, a museum that we all love, he said that this was a real opportunity for him because it made it possible for him to go and find knowledge where museums had never really gone to find out information. So they need museums need something strong like a legislative act to help us to go and find the history. So that feeds into our reflection. So Lynda, over to you for about 10 minutes, if that's okay, until about 8 p.m. Paris time. I don't know what time it is for you. It must be 10 hours less, but it would be good to be able to have time to discuss afterwards. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. I have just set my timer for 10 minutes. I am very honored to be here this evening with you all, and want to extend my deepest thanks to ICOM France as well as the Institute, and my deep appreciation for the speakers who have preceded me. They have raised many thought-provoking questions regarding museums and displays, and I've got as many questions as I do things that I'd like to talk about. So without further ado, I'm going to start with something that I think many of the other speakers have alluded to, and that is, who am I and where am I in this space? I am an attorney. I live in Colorado. I used to work for the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I am now a county deputy attorney doing very rural kinds of work, which I very much enjoy. And I am also white, of a certain age, and I live in a society of colonizers. And that is to say that my heritage, my education, my benefits that I have enjoyed in my society are all the result of living in a particular kind of society that was based on conquest. It was based on looting, it was based on pillaging, and many would argue that it still is today. It was based on slavery. So when I come into these conversations, I need to, and the phrase that people use in the United States is, quote, check your privilege. And that means, okay, I think I know something about this topic, but I may not know as much as I think. And I acknowledge that I am full of biases that I don't even know I have because of the way I live in this society and the things that I have enjoyed as a result of it. And it's also important, I think, to talk about where I'm at in this country, because right now this country is in a lot of political, social upheaval. There have been a lot of things happening. There have been losses of fundamental rights. And congratulations to France regarding your constitutional efforts. I salute those. And there have also been other developments, and one of those has been something called DEIA, although you'll hear the acronym in different ways. And that generally stands for diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. And museums were some of the first communities, along with libraries and along with universities, to really kind of jump into this training and what it meant. And there was a huge backlash, and still is a huge backlash against this kind of conversation, if you will, in American society that continues to this day. It's also known as wokeism, depending on which side of the political spectrum you're on. But this is a very tumultuous background for our country in particular when we look at these regulations and how they were passed. NAGPRA was originally passed back in 1990. And it's very important to remember that this is something the United States rarely does. It came right out and said it. This is human rights legislation. We may be talking about objects, we may be talking about culture, we may be talking about society, but this is human rights legislation. It is designed to repatriate and make whole a community that was ravaged by colonization. I don't think genocide is too far a stretch, to be honest, although, again, this is something that's hotly contested in the United States. So NAGPRA, in some ways, is a natural reflection of DEIA and what's kind of going on in those conversations. But it is also something that these new regulations have been seen as a long time coming. And I know you all had mentioned the president of the American Museum of Natural History, and I just wanted to quote something from one of the articles I read. And here's what he has to say on the topic. The halls we are closing are artifacts of an era when museums such as ours did not respect the values, perspectives, and indeed shared humanity of indigenous peoples. Actions that may feel sudden to some may seem long overdue to others. And that is where I can't speak for this community because I'm not part of it, but based on other experiences I've had, the Native American community believes this is far too little, far too late in terms of the damage that was done and the human rights impetus behind this legislation. So it really is intended to, I guess light a fire might be accurate. It really is intended to create a timeline, 5 years, to return human remains and to also start being serious about your funerary objects and how you're handling and treating those. And when I say get serious, what do I mean? Well, when you talk about a museum, and again, some of the wonderful things I've heard tonight, it's about developing narrative, and it's about being like the new museum definition in service of society. You're educating the public and you're conserving heritage. These are such important goals. What NAGPRA really gets into is whose society are we talking about? Service to whom? Which public are you talking about? The public that is representative of the colonizers? Or are you talking about a tribe? I can pretty much guarantee you that when AMNH opened its Great Plains Indians exhibition, it was not intended to appeal to the Lakota tribe. It was not intended to include the perspectives of the Arapaho or the Cheyenne. It was intended for the public of New York City, and it was intended as education. I think that was legitimately some of the goals, but it was also the way this society showed off its conquests for the greater good of mankind. But still, these were possessions that did not belong to the society that was displaying them. And I think that this lack of connection, and again, someone else has talked about this, the lack of connection between the public and these objects has become an ontological discussion for American museums. because it really is baked into our DNA. And the question is whether or not we can change this. There has to be a connection. There has to be a conversation, and there has to be a return where it's warranted. And that's what these NAGPRA regulations require. One of the other things that I think is really important about this is to think about, someone was talking about the violence of characterizations. And wow, that is a very powerful phrase, because there is a lot of violence there, and you're characterizing objects, and you're representing tribes. But the difference now, and I hope it will come to pass, is that there is a tremendous difference between the representation of tribes and the representation by tribes. And that's what these NAGPRA regs are aimed to correct. They mean that the voices of those who have been dispossessed must be listened to as a matter of human rights laws. So for as many museums that have shuttered their exhibitions, just as many smaller, and they tend to be out west as opposed to back east, but they've stayed open. And they've stayed open because they've already engaged and are engaging in these conversations. Canadian museums, the Northwest Territories, they've done an amazing job. They didn't even need NAGPRA to do it, but they've got other legal mechanisms that have helped them come to this sort of reconciliation. The Museum of Us in San Diego, fantastic. History Colorado, here in my state, they're open. So I think there's this, oh my God, doors are shutting, these objects will never be displayed again. You got to look at the glass as half full and see how you can grow and what you can learn from this experience. And I understand the concept of inalienability in French law as it relates to French culture, and how fundamental that is to French law, that these objects are inalienable. They cannot be sold or disposed of or destroyed, because they are the collective heritage of the French people. And I think if anyone can understand how the tribes feel, a lot of it is right there. These are objects that were inalienable to the tribes. They may not have articulated it the way we would articulate it, but there was a serious harm here that needs to be rectified. One of the interesting things about the regs is that they also require that you give equal weight to the oral traditions of the tribes, not just written documentation. And that's going to be important too. So I will end, and I think the question of can we exhibit anything becomes for American museums in the NAGPRA space. Can we display anything without permission of those from whom these items were taken? And that is a question that I think American museums are well equipped for, and I think we will do very, very well in implementing this. God knows it's time. This has been going on for many, many decades, and it's time to get it fixed. So with that, I will end. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It's really interesting to hear about the fact that the museums in parts of the US and Canada have remained open because they were already established. And I think that this is something that's very important. If you agree, we've got another half an hour together. I would love to open up debate now. And I would like to ask, first of all, if there is anybody with a question here in the room. And then also, if you have any questions online, please do share them, and we will be able to answer your questions. Obviously, if you don't have any questions, we'll be able to continue discussion together. But anybody asking a question, please do introduce yourselves with your name, your function, your job, if that will just help us with the transcription later on as well. Are there any questions or comments about what has been shared here in person, perhaps? I cannot see any for now. Are there some in the chat on Zoom? Oh, yes, there's a question at the back of the room. Thank you very much. Sorry, I know that you're going to need to run with the microphone to the other side of the room. Thank you. Good evening. My name is Sébastien Magro. I am a consultant and I am a publisher of a newsletter on the colonial heritage of France. We've often used this term of the person who is affected. I would like to know what the role is of the people affected by matters in museums nowadays. So what is the role of these people affected? What is the role of people in short? Because if we're thinking about this idea of the public, which I think is a little bit reductive, I've always found this expression a little bit reductive. We can not be both public and a person affected. If we are a person affected, we can't just be a member of the public. We're not going to be able to know something that we know already. This is a matter of identity. It's not just about being sensitive to the question. So, and this might shock you, but I think we need to leave behind this question of the public. It's perhaps difficult to do that, but in order to reintroduce actors, individuals, people who come and who are able to speak, we're not going to confiscate their voice because they have a place and it's not just as a receiving public. I like to talk about publics in the plural because when we're talking about people who are affected, are we talking about the communities from which the objects come, or women who feel like they're able to identify with the women portrayed by Picasso, or perhaps Native Americans who have been stripped of their lands? So that's why I think we need to be talking about publics in the plural. If we look at our museums and all of the debates that we've had this evening, museums also are a history of the violence of humanity. And this history of violence is experienced by people who have been victimized by it, been a victim of it, and by those who have perpetrated it. And these two publics see the museum differently. And today we think that this triangle, museum, heritage, and social justice has never been so close. And that is why we need to see public in the plural to make the museum. This is a place testifying from the violence of humanity. We need to make it a place of reconciliation. Thank you so much, Malik. Camille, do you have anything you'd like to add to this question? I hope that you're here and can still hear us. Yes, thank you for this question. And this question of the people affected is so vast, but let me come back to an exhibition that I worked on where it was called Revenir, Coming Back. It was about migrations and first, second, and third generation migrants and the ties that we can keep to the mother country, the roots that we can have there. And when designing this kind of exhibition, we cannot do this by ourselves. We need to be co-curators with a public that's not just a receiving public, but an active public. People who were able to co-write this with us. They were lending documents and personal documents, working with the public department here at the museum. This is a performative piece of art will also be presented, which will allow visitors to come to the museum and actually share their own experiences within the museum space. I think that we are all sensitive in museums to the role that we are increasingly giving to co-curatorship. I think this is a very significant change at play in all institutions. So how can we work not just for, but also with our publics? Let's take this plural term, as Malik was saying. Thank you so much, Camille. Lynda, do you have anything you would like to add?
Just very, very generally, if I understand the question, the role of those who have been dispossessed is the phrase that I'm using. And I think that is a very difficult question. And the answer is going to take a lot of work. I think it is listening and learning to listen on the parts of those of us who are not in that role. I think it involves hiring a lot of people in the museum professions who represent some of these diverse voices so that we really can bake new DNA into our institutions that really understand these other narratives and can speak to them in ways that I couldn't. So I think it's going to be a long-standing effort. I think we need to be careful, or I need to be careful of the white messiah complex that, you know, as a white female lawyer of a certain age in the United States, I'm going to come in and fix it all. And that's not my role. My role is to listen. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynda. It's great that you're talking about this difficulty. It's something that we don't talk about a lot. You talked about this Messiah complex. So this is something that I'm going to talk about. We're perhaps noble in our intentions, but this is something that is difficult, displacing our perspective and questioning authorities and authorship, as Camille was saying. And I know that I'm working on an exhibition called Exiles at the moment. I'm co-curator with the École du Louvre. We're launching this in September, and we're organizing a collection with inhabitants who have experienced exile or whose family members have experienced exile. And it's good. We're working a lot on voices and listening at the moment. And this is very complex, but incredibly essential. Emmanuelle, sorry, over to you. Yes, I wanted to add something. I am very aware that it's difficult to set aside this notion of public, but it's quite violent when we're talking about categorization, the categorization of people and objects presented in museums. I do not think that we want to be adding violence in this categorization. And I think there's a real homogenization of people who are actually very different from each other. And we do need categories to work in museums, but these should be operational. But in that way, I think when we're considering forms of violence, this categorization may actually add something and cause disconnection and cause a lack of reciprocity. This may appear a little bit simplistic, but the mission of the museum is to give back to the population that is affected, the dispossessed population. I think that there was another question in the room. Over to you, Mom. I think I saw someone with their hand up. Thank you very much. My name is Anne Santilli from the Mediation Association for Contemporary Art. Thank you very much for your enriching presentations and for these discussions around the term publics. I've heard some really exciting things about the historical context, and I think that these are interesting, not just because it is right and it's good, but because it's interesting for us as well, working in museums with this sedimentation and strata of different perspectives and to promote perspectives around an object. This is a real challenge in museums, and we need to keep these different layers as part of the work of of art itself. Thank you very much, Mum, for this comment. I don't know if we're going to need to say anything, but yes, the perspective that we have is very important, and previous perspectives as well. And I think that this is something that we need to recall. This can cause some conflict. Malik, you reminded us of this. So this violence associated with artwork is present, but it's not always shared. So I think that this is important to remind ourselves. I don't know if anybody else would like to say anything. Thank you very much for your comment in any case, Emmanuelle. Yes, I really like this idea of sedimentation. The idea of having a real system here where there's different layers to see it's written, rewritten, confiscated, taken back. There's a real process here. It's not just the object in itself. That doesn't really exist in that simple form. I think that's what's hardest to explain is the journey that these objects have been on, and we need a lot of people to be able to do this, and we need to come out of our own professions in some way, to have a team focusing on the project. And I think that's very important. The sedimentation of perspectives means that we need to tell lots of stories, and this is something that's very complex and something that needs to be shared. I think that Natalie had a question very discreetly. I saw you raise your hand, Natalie Bondy, who is director of the Museum of the Arab Institute. Thank you so much for these presentations. They have been very interesting. I wanted to say something about museums that have a history of violence. I've spent a lot of time in North America, particularly in Canada, and I've been able to see how much we need this sedimentation, this nuance, this complexity and contextualization. Because when we work in a museum with its collections, it's a matter of engagement, but also it's an institutional voice that is addressed to a multiple and diverse community. This type of shortcut is sometimes very damaging and harmful, because not all museums are the same, and the collections in a museum are not the same either. There are collections that may be contemporary, that may come from one place or another. I'm saying this because I've really experienced it, this nuance that exists about where we are. So if we're in Dakar, in Arizona, in Mucem, in Marseille, or in the Arab world, we don't have the same history, and the collections don't have the same history. And so I think we need nuance, and this is the most complex exercise, yet the most necessary in this period of such great divide. The complexity that you raise is the fact that the museum voice is always diverse and it needs time in order to be expressed. And this time is not dedicating much time to public debate, but perhaps this is what sets us apart in this ability to explain. Perhaps that's something that we need to be promoting more strongly than we had in the past. There is a question over there. Over to you, Mum. Good evening. Thank you very much. I'm doing a master's in art history at the moment. I have a question. It may be a little naive, but in any case, when we're asking about can we exhibit everything, but who's choosing what we're exhibiting? This is a question that we need to ask. Who has the right to choose this? And linked to this, would the question be, how can we exhibit everything? There's digital museums now, meaning that we can exhibit all museum collections sometimes. How can we take ownership of these objects in a digital museum? How can we now exhibit this across all of our exhibit collections? This can be very complex. Thank you very much. This is a very broad question. Who should choose? This is something we mentioned very briefly at the start. Emmanuelle? Let me try and answer it. This is power. We're talking about politics here, policy, not in the sense of our political leaders, but there are decisions to be made. There's discrimination in the scientific meaning. We're discriminating between one option and another. And this can lead to injustice. And there's a real long history behind who has the right to exhibit, who has the power to show something, but also who has the power to want to conserve it, to keep it for themselves. And here the question is also raised about this idea of being a collector. The person who has the most power is not necessarily the person exhibiting, because they're allowing people to have a view over something. But what about the collector, the person who has their own collection, who's trying to enrich themselves through that? I think this goes beyond the question of who is exhibiting. We cannot really break this down because there's so many other aspects, and who really has the interest in exhibiting. I'm talking here about the political interest and many other interests, of course. Yes, to give a technical perspective now, the history of museums is the history of acquisitions, and it's very interesting to talk about the history of taste, but also it is a historical story. So the history of museums in my field of modern art, it's really fascinating from this perspective, because the way in which we acquire works is key. What are we acquiring? And these are the kinds of questions that we need to ask when thinking about the representation of women artists in the collection. What are our go-tos when we're presenting a work? Are we really thinking about a balanced or fair representation between male and female artists, non-Western artists, etc.? So this is really at the heart of changes to the museum, the hidden side of the museum. We're talking about perspective a lot, but it's also how we build our collections as well. And these are very vast questions, really at the heart of our profession. May I add something, says Malik? Yes, Camille gave a technical response, so I'm not going to call that into question at all, but I would like to talk about the assurance that we need. When I said that the museum is a place of violence, this isn't a shortcut. It's a shortcut if it's the only face that we're showing of the museum, but that's not the only face of the museum. The museum, above all, is a space of encounter and dialogue, where we go to try and understand other cultures, understand other people. So that's how we need to see it. It's not an absolute. It's one of the characteristics of the museum, and particularly a characteristic when we're talking about its collections and ethnographic museums, and that specific type of museum that I was talking about earlier, to have this balance between museums and social justice with resonance through the example that we heard in Colorado as well. So thank you so much, Malik. To come back now to this question of choice, I think it's important to make it visible. The museum has inherited a choice. It's not a kind of totalitarianism where everything has been conserved. That's not true. And when we start to look into the subjectivity of this and make this visible, we're sharing the authority somewhat. For many years, fine arts museums acted as if the museum represented the totality of everything, and that's not true. Even very large museums, even the Louvre Museum where I've worked, not all the collections are in all fields, and we know that. But that idea was left to fester somewhat, and I think we need to be showing this subjectivity, the choices of museums, and this really opens up the possibility of subjectivity of visitors and actors coming into the space. Allow me just to add a nuance now. I think we're convinced that, you know, we've completely balanced perspective right now, and we are hoping that in the future we're going to be increasing in balance. Yes, I do agree. I didn't imagine that we had a completely balanced solution either. But yes, this idea of there being a chronology of art history that was a little bit systematic and totalitarian in its approach is something that we are now able to challenge, and we're able to present some of the sensitive choices. Another question.
Yes, there's been a number of questions in the chat on Zoom that I wanted to talk about. First of all, there's a question that connects into what we've already been talking about. She was just asking the question of the status of the authority of museums that we've talked about and how we can better communicate the notion of impermanence of this status and the collections. There's also a question for you, Cécile, from Laure Pressac, which talks about its problematic exhibition in New York, which deconstructed the figure of Picasso in the eyes of an actor. And she asks whether this type of exhibition could have happened in Paris. And the second question is, do you think the reason that you've been able to put in place all these changes in the Picasso Museum is because you are a female curator? Well, the exhibition that you're talking about in Brooklyn that we took part in through loans. Well, personally, very honestly and frankly, I wouldn't have done this exhibition in this way. It was very interesting, but it was very militant. It used the one-woman show perspective to make a direct and perhaps more popular connection with this question. There was a lot of debate in the press around this decision, this approach. And I wouldn't have a very sort of clear response about that particular project, but I wouldn't have done it just because it's not my particular approach, my way of working. I think there were some positive aspects to it and also some more problematic aspects around the theoretical and historical development of feminism versus Picasso, which perhaps we could have developed a bit more in a bit more of a solid way, but I'm good friends with the curators that produced this. I have lots of respect for them, and yes, of course, the fact that I'm a woman has made some of this a bit easier. Indeed, of course. Another two questions in the Zoom chat. First question comes from Pamela Caldas, which is in Spanish, so I hope I'm understanding it properly. There's a question about the role of the museographic museums that Camille talked about and how they can give meaning to objects. And another question from Francesca Del Lago about objects that have been selected by individuals that don't necessarily belong to a represented community. So we've talked a bit about this already, but how can we resolve this question in the contemporary period in order to resituate objects in the historical context? Camille, perhaps we should hand over to you for the question about museographic museums. I think there are as many museographical options as there are museums and curators. What we're trying to do is, as I said, is to try and target visitors from a museum to visitors to a museum which is not an ethnography museum in Marseille. We saw that we have a great deal of diversity of visitors who come to us, and some of them are already affected by the question, connected into these questions, and others said that the inverted map that was presented was a real revelation. I'd never thought about the fact that this planisphere that we know so well was not just the universal planisphere that exists. So what was really important for us was to reach people and help visitors appropriate a new perspective and leave not necessarily with answers, but with new questions. And this question is really very open. There's a reinvention of proposals for each project every time. Yes, we can do this every time when we do temporary exhibitions. This gives us an opportunity to take a new approach and to think about how we present the museum. And I think that's something that's really important to take into account. And of course, there are ecological aspects we need to take into account as well. Malik, perhaps you have something to say? Perhaps I could just respond to Francesca's question about selection. Because I'm in a museum where more than 60% of objects in our collections have been collected before the foundation of Senegal as a country. But the word collected is a problem in itself, and would have to have a meeting of this kind just around the word collection and collect. But the question is really interesting because I am in a position where I choose by procuration, as it were, by proxy. I select objects, but actually I don't have a choice because most of the artifacts were put in place before Senegalese researchers could go and look at the collection. That's why what we do is that we invite artists, and what we are doing in cultural mediation through performances is that we try to deconstruct the archives and revisit and re-explore the archives by giving carte blanche to the artists who don't worry about all our art historian and scientific methodology, but they open up doors and they connect people, they connect worlds and concepts. The classic methodology would not make this possible without dysfunction, without malfunction. So what we are doing is that we're working on the history of museums, because in our museum have not been collected by our society or by the Senegalese, but by others. So if I come back to this question, I think we have to work a lot on cultural mediation, work a lot on these techniques of cultural mediation, and really give space for creativity and the creation of artists. Yes, because artistic mediation really gives us something very interesting. Emily, do we have time for another question? In the audience, is there another question? Good evening, Andreas Cassi. I'm I'm a security staff major member at the Louvre Museum, and I have a question about staff, security staff in the rooms. How can we make a connection? How as security staff, and how can we make a connection between the works and the audiences, the visitors that come through? Connections. I think, well, we decided to invite them to this event. We also put in place continuous training operations. We've worked with the Quebec Museum on the way in which security staff can end up receiving aggressive and being the recipients of aggressive behavior from the visitors. So there was a workshop put in place. I wasn't there, I didn't take part in it, but I think it went well. And there was an attempt to help people understand, because something I noticed was that security staff are often people living outside of central Paris. Often they are a little bit older. Often it's men, sometimes people with an immigrant background. So you can understand that on questions around Picasso, relationship with women, there may be perceptions that might be very different. So I don't think there really is any particular recipe to put in place, but we as curators, we are responsible for sharing the programmation, the program, or what we're trying to do, and then to share all of the debates that we encounter. And so that involves meetings, team meetings, of course, and also other questions. I think we think a lot about how we can give information about how collections travel and how they are transported. But I think this is something that's really important to work with those who are on the front line of connection with audiences and visitors. I don't know whether we do it well, whether we do it enough or not. That's really a question of our daily life, of our daily experience. I think there was just one final question on the second row here. So this is a question that I find very interesting. How can we raise these questions and determine who is legitimate for giving authorization? Lynda, could you answer this question?
Of course, my battery is dying, so if I get cut off, I apologize. I think you ask questions. You ask questions and you listen. Many American museums have used the excuse of we cannot repatriate because we don't know who to repatriate to. This could belong to one of 100 different tribes. We picked it up. We don't know when, we don't know where. How can we possibly figure out where this goes? And the regulations now say that question is a question you museums must answer. It's not on the tribes to tell you what to do. You need to figure it out. So the museums are going to have to be a lot more proactive in getting out there and understanding where their collections came from. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Lynda. That's really very clear. In fact, it's very similar to what we have here in our law. It's the responsibility of the museums that must make the decision and go and find these things out. There's a final question on the chat for Camille in terms of collections of museums in France and Algeria. In the Mucem, the question is that in the Mucem, you have collections from Algeria and elsewhere. What do you think of these collections that cannot yet be exhibited, and why does the museum not manage to open them up? Is it because the objects and testimonials that we presented are going to cause perturbations, or are they going to offend? Well, I could answer that question, but you'd need to give me an hour or so. At Mucem, we still have these collections, and we put in place a cycle of lecture sessions and public debate sessions up to 2022, and which focused not only on Algeria but the whole of North Africa. And we brought together these objects and talked about the voice of these objects to think about how this colonial heritage can today serve as a source for discussion and discussions around these painful colonial questions. And we had some public debates which were really very powerful around these works. And we heard from visitors who came and told us that the Mucem was responding to silence, so filling a gap. And part of these collections are presented in a future permanent exhibition called Multiple or Plural Mediterraneans, and we're going to be developing an image of these different Mediterranean approaches through a focus on ethnographic museums from the 19th and 20th century, but we're also exhibiting a number of different museums, and in Paris, or connecting into museums in Paris at the Trocadero and also in Montpellier, with a focus on this vision on the Mediterranean, particularly in post-colonial countries. And there'll be a critical perspective on this. I don't want to take too much time because I think we're already running late, but the difficulties that these museums face are there's a whole range of them. But you may know that the presidents of the French Republic and the Ministry of Culture are working on and developing an institute. I don't think it's because the works and the objects that are presented are offensive, because we have a vocation to talk about this colonial history, but there's a lot of work still to be done, and a number of different museums and curators are working on this. And I think whether it's the Quai Branly Museum or the Mucem or other museums, that there are 3 national museums working on these issues of social questions, and these are areas that are going to become more and more visible in the future, and we will not be hiding these collections, of course. Thank you, Camille, for this very clear answer. I think it's going to be time for us to wrap up. I just wanted very quickly to thank all of the speakers today. Thank you for being with us here in Paris, but also in Marseille and in Colorado. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Thank you to all of people in the audience and the many questions. Thank you for your contribution to this evening, which has helped us to see to what extent museums are living. They're living or vibrant institutions, as we were saying earlier. I think we all have a big responsibility with the opportunity that we have to work in these institutions focused on the past, the present, and the future, but these are also institutions in which are developed by the human beings working in them and human beings that visit them. I think we really have an amazing opportunity to be focused on this long-term perspective, but also this short-term perspective, and to be able to work on these two aspects, the long-term narrative and the short-term narrative, to be able to offer spaces for dialogue, conservation, but also conversation, and the opportunity for shared dialogue. We really must never forget this opportunity that we have and make it more visible, because museums are institutions that are the most engaged, imaginative, and also perhaps sometimes the most fragile institutions. These are the first institutions to be victim when things go a bit wild in the world. So we really need to protect them. And thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to the INP, French Heritage Institute, and to ICOM and the president of ICOM. And I'm going to hand very quickly now over for the conclusion of the INP.
I'm not going to be giving you a conclusion. I'm going to be issuing you an invitation. We would like to have a symposium with the Press Institute as well. And this will be on the 22nd and 23rd of April, all day on the 22nd and just the morning of the 23rd. This symposium will be entitled Sensitive Objects. Sensitive, not just in terms of their tangible materiality, but more in terms of their ethics, morals, the history, culture, religion. This is a symposium that will be discussing similar premises to this evening. I'm sure it will be of interest to you. It's a bit longer, so perhaps there will be an opportunity to develop some of the topics discussed briefly today. This is introduced annually by the French Heritage Institute, and here we will be focusing particularly on sensitive objects. It's designed for any directors of institutions that have exhibitions, not just museums, universities as well, lawyers. So we'll discuss things such as the responsibility of museums and cultural institutions to take into account societal issues, censure and auto-censure, and the legal framework as well. So it will be relatively similar to what we've discussed this evening. So I hope that you find this interesting. So once again, it's the 22nd and 23rd of April in this same auditorium from 9 a.m. It is open to all.